From the KSL Broadcast House, this is Sunday Edition with Doug Wright.
And good morning and welcome to our program. Last week, more than 20 Utah Republicans issued cease and desist letters to abortion providers and funding organizations. They claim violations of the state's abortion trigger law. Since the letters went out, some Utah Republican lawmakers have removed their names from those letters. One of those is State Representative Steve Handy. He told KSL News Radio he was retracting his name.
My understanding when I was presented the letter was that it was more cautionary. It seems to me that the letter is a little harsher than I recall agreeing to sign on to.
So are you?
But I do agree that the law. What's that, Jeff?
I want to know if you're walking away from your signature on the letter.
Yes, I'm walking away from my signature on the letter.
Here's one of the letters. This one was sent to Karrie Galloway, the CEO of Planned Parenthood Association of Utah. The letters are issued on official Utah House of Representatives letterhead. They say criminal sanctions can be pursued against anyone currently providing and assisting abortions if the injunction is lifted. That injunction was issued in July, on July 11th, by 3rd District Court Judge Andrew Stone. Utah's abortion trigger law would have banned abortions except for rape, incest, or the mother's health at risk. That trigger law was blocked from taking effect with the injunction after Planned Parenthood sued the state, arguing the law violates the rights guaranteed in Utah's Constitution. Judge Stone's injunction did not affect an 18-week abortion ban, which went into effect following the Supreme Court's overturning of Roe v. Wade. That means abortions are currently legal in Utah until 18 weeks. At that point, they are banned with limited exceptions. The letter was penned by State Representatives Birkeland of Morgan, Utah, and Karrie and Lisonbee of Clearfield. We invited both lawmakers to be on the show this morning. They accepted and then later declined our invitations. But in statements sent out last week, they clarified the letters were not a threat to abortion providers, but an opinion of the legislators who signed it. They go on to say that while they are disappointed with the judge's ruling to stay enforcement of SB 174, they respect the law and the process. There is a lot to dive into with these letters sent by Utah lawmakers. We'll look at the legality of the letters themselves, how enforceable they are, if at all, and were any laws broken. We'll bring on a law professor to break it down. But first, when we do come back, Planned Parenthood Association of Utah will be here and we'll discuss the issue. Welcome back to Sunday Edition, and Planned Parenthood Association of Utah was one of the organizations sent the letter by Utah lawmakers. Utah's Planned Parenthood CEO, Karrie Galloway, joins me now to talk about this issue. And Karrie, it wasn't all that long ago you were here. We were talking about the Supreme Court decision and what some of the ramifications might be. We addressed some of the issues, the trigger law, what would happen. But maybe you could, first of all, bring us up to speed, because it was your organization, I think, in the lawsuit that you instigated that got the injunction from Judge Stone in place.
You're right. Planned Parenthood did ask Judge Stone to look at our case, and he provided the injunction based on the arguments, and we've been moving forward since then.
How long is the injunction expected to, or does it have a drop-dead deadline to last?
This injunction that we have lasts through the court case.
I see.
And the court case is stated to begin a year from September. The court's busy, and that's the court date we've been given.
I'm curious, this letter has obviously been talked about a lot. Even some GOP legislators on Utah's Capitol Hill were a little upset when they read it. Some claim that they read it a little too quickly, didn't realize how harsh it was. Some of the names have been extracted from the letter since. But did you have any idea that this was headed your way, or did it hit you just out of the blue?
To be honest, we were totally taken off guard by this letter. It's not part of the usual proceedings. And since we've learned that it was the legislator's opinion to send the letter, and to be honest with you, it really didn't make sense. Of course, we went to our lawyers because we know that we are operating in full compliance with the law, as we always do, with the preliminary injunction. So the language of the letter, the tone of the letter really surprised us.
I don't know about you, but anytime I get anything on letterhead that looks real official, it somehow makes me a little wary, or I pay more attention to it, or it scares me a little more.
Well, it was official state legislature, and because it didn't make sense, you had to read it quite a few times because it was disregarding Judge Stone's actions. It was calling into question things that didn't make sense. It was overstepping its bounds, but when written by legislators, you pay attention.
Yeah.
And they wrote it as though they had the force of law behind them. And we don't like breaking the law.
Let's talk about the other organizations. I don't know exactly how many organizations actually received a letter from the legislature on this. You and I off the air were speculating, what, maybe five?
5 or 6.
6.
Both of the providers of abortion here in Utah received the letter. A physician, they sent it to the Utah Abortion Fund, which provides funding for people who can't afford health care. It was sent to our national organization, who represents us in this case. A few others, I'm not sure. And a national abortion rights organization.
We had hoped, again, to ask some of these specific questions on the other end, but unfortunately, our legislators did not join us today. Let's talk about the other organizations. Is there any kind of coordinated effort or response when you get something like this? It affects not only you, but others who are basically in kind of the same boat. Is there a coordinated effort? Do you talk to one another?
Well, not on a formal basis. Of course, we immediately talk to our lawyers because, as I said, we never intentionally break the law. And we clarified that they were as confused as we were by the letter. We spoke with our physician, of course. And then we made sure that we alerted our staff so they could talk to clients when they come in. There's been a lot of press about abortion and who has the right to my, as a woman, bodily integrity. And for people coming in for services, whether abortion, family planning, general health care, they may worry that someone's going to call the police. And we want to make sure that no woman or her family are worried about getting completely legal health care.
Karrie, in the few moments that we have left here, let's clarify exactly where we are. With Judge Stone's injunction and in place through this whole legal process, has anything fundamentally changed?
Abortion was illegal for a couple of days right after the Supreme Court ruled, and the state determined that they had the right to enforce their trigger law. Our lawsuit dropped. That happened on a Friday. By Monday afternoon, Judge Stone had made his first injunction, and we were able to continue to provide health care and have been able to provide health care throughout this process through the legal procedures. I guess we have been working to make sure that people of Utah know their rights, can access their health care, and build the best families as they choose and can support. I have to say, it's been a discouraging week on another front, that the legislature missed an opportunity this week during special session to move forward Representative Lesser, Dr. Lesser's bill on postpartum care. Here we have a trigger law that the state legislature is fighting to put in place to take away a woman's bodily autonomy on pregnancy. And here the state had a chance to pass a bill, or at least to move forward a bill, providing health care postpartum, and they chose not to.
I appreciate you bringing that up. I was not fully up to speed on what did or did not happen in that regard. There's so many other things. If the injunction were to be lifted, what would that bring about? But that will have to, due to our timing today, have to be a topic for another day. But Karrie, thank you so much for joining us from Planned Parenthood today.
Thank you for asking the questions, Doug.
Karrie Galloway with us. And we will be right back. We'll kind of take a legal point of view, and there was quite an op-ed in the Salt Lake Tribune on this very issue. Stay with us. Welcome back to the program today. University of Utah Law Professor Teneille Brown is joining me now on the show via Zoom to talk about the letters that we have been referencing. And Professor, thank you so much for joining us on Sunday Edition. If I might, I'd like to open by quoting from the op-ed piece that you authored in the Salt Lake Tribune. Despite fighting a revolution over it, we seem to be getting more comfortable with politicians who act like kings. And then there's a little bit, I'll cut a few things out and paraphrase here and there. You mentioned you might be thinking I'm talking about a former president or whatever, but, quoting now again, but I'm not. I'm talking about the 24 Utah Republicans who issued cease and desist letters to abortion providers last week. And then you go through a list of things that fundamentally were wrong here. And first, they got the law wrong. Let's talk about that aspect of it first, because this is a very tough op-ed piece. How far out of bounds were our legislators who sent this letter and signed this letter?
So they were out of bounds in at least three different ways. First of all, they misunderstand how injunctions work, and they quoted from an article that was written by someone who doesn't represent anywhere close to the mainstream view on how injunctions work. And I think this was probably ghost-written by an individual who has a very particular take on injunctions, which again does not represent well-settled law. So they had this idea that you could have an injunction in place, and yet the behavior that is protected by the injunction could somehow be prosecuted after it is lifted. And they were suggesting that the abortion providers were misunderstanding the law. And in fact, they were the ones, the writers of these cease and desist letters, they're the ones who misunderstand the law.
As I read a little deeper into the op-ed, after first, the part about they got the law wrong, this part of your op-ed intrigued me. You say, but wait, there's more. All appearances to the contrary, the legislators and candidates who signed this letter have zero power to enforce any of the laws that they cited. As I read that letter, it was, to me, it came across, and we had a little soundbite earlier from Representative Steve Handy, who said, well, it was, as I reread it, is a little harsher than I'd anticipated. The clout that was implied in this letter, how serious is that, again, of being out of bounds?
So I think you've hit the nail on the head with why this is so important, because Planned Parenthood has attorneys on retainer. They get very good legal advice. But the problem here is if this letter had gone to someone like you or me or someone who doesn't have a law degree, they would read this and they would reasonably think that this letter had the threat of law and that the people who received this letter, let's say you were doing something like you're providing vaccines or you're providing gender conforming surgery, and legislators don't like that. So they send you a letter with the seal of the House of Representatives saying you're not allowed to do your profession anymore. And if you don't have an attorney to consult, you're going to think that that means that's the law, and they're threatening prosecution. And so most people receiving a letter like this would stop doing what they're legally allowed to do. And here, again, the Planned Parenthood has attorneys who could read the letter and say, this is a complete misstatement of the law. There is nothing in this letter that actually should change what you're doing. But the problem here is that they were being bullies, misstating the law, and threatening prosecution for things that are legal. And then the problem with them impersonating law enforcement is that the legislature, we're assuming now the people who wrote this, who are actually legislators as opposed to the ones who are just candidates, they can't enforce the law. That's up to our prosecutors. That's up to our county prosecutors, our state prosecutors. That is not the job of the legislature. So they misstated the law wrong, which is a problem. They disrespected a court order, which was the injunction that was issued. And then they also put on this veneer of law enforcement and were threatening prosecution. And they can't do that. They don't have the power to prosecute. That's not their job. So they misstated the law. They fundamentally misunderstood this idea of separation of powers, which is that the legislature writes the laws, they don't enforce them, and they don't get to interpret them. But they tried to interpret the judicial order, and they did so incorrectly. They tried to tell private individuals what they were going to do and how the law would be enforced, and they have no power over that. They even included some federal statutes, which they have, even if they were law enforcement in Utah, have no power to enforce. So they were trying to take advantage of the letterhead to exploit the appearance of power to bully people into doing what they did not need to do legally.
Professor, one part of your op-ed, too, that caught my attention, and it says, even if they weren't trampling on our rights and confusing the public in the process, indeed creating legal chaos and staying in the limelight is likely the point. Let's talk about that. You implied a little earlier or alluded to the fact that maybe the legislators weren't really the ones that wrote this, and it's somebody with, perhaps I can use the word, agenda here. Let's talk about that. How important here is the chaos and the limelight to what is unfolding for certain individuals?
Yeah, that's a really key point, because if individuals aren't aware of what the law is, they may be less likely to get health care to which they're entitled. So there is an impact on patients who read about this in the newspaper, they read about this online, and they think that their abortion providers are going to be violating the law by doing something that they're actually legally allowed to do. So the threat of this letter, that being issued as a cease and desist order on state letterhead and getting in the news, is going to discourage some people from seeing their healthcare providers, even people who worked at some of these facilities. And they're not all Planned Parenthood. Some of them are individual OBs who work in the area. Some of the staff at these clinics were worried that they were going to be prosecuted based on these cease and desist letters. So there were definitely trickle-down effects where people were afraid that they were going to be prosecuted for doing something that they're legally allowed to do. And I do worry that creating this chaos was part of the point. They want people to be confused because they know when they're confused, they're not going to seek out the health care that they're legally entitled to, at least as of now. And that may change. A judge may decide that this trigger ban should go into effect. And then from that day forward, people could be prosecuted. But they just completely misstated the whole purpose of injunctions. An injunction would be meaningless if you could be prosecuted for something that is enjoined from being prosecuted. That's the whole point of an injunction. So I think they were trying to exploit the appearance of power to scare people into doing what they wanted them to do, which is a real abuse of power. I would like to think we live in a state that follows the rule of law, that cares about process. And so even if you take the issue out of this and insert a different issue that is not abortion and access to abortion, we should all be very concerned about legislators using their bully pulpit to tell individual citizens what they are and are not allowed to do, especially when they get the law wrong.
You have expressed the hope that there will be some political accountability.
Yes.
You know, I was wondering about that after I read your op-ed piece and in anticipation of our conversation here. There seems to be an element on the political landscape today that cheers this type of thing. And so my question was going to be, is this a reflection of their constituents and And are there those who will be cheering, even though if it's out of bounds, below the belt, I mean, use innumerable terms that we associate with this, will there be a certain element that is absolutely cheering right now?
Yes, there are. I've seen them on social media, and they're very happy to cut and paste sections of the U.S. code or the Utah code that they don't understand, claiming that people were violating federal laws that they have not violated. And for them, it's not about the facts. This is a post-fact kind of world and constituency where the reason I wanted this to come into a courtroom is so the facts could be litigated, and it wouldn't be something that is just being litigated in social media where people are trading stories that are not substantiated by the facts. And they think they can cite to someone's article on a right-wing think tank website and say that's the law. Well, it turns out that's not the law. The judge who issued the order knows what the law is. But I think you're right that this is playing to their base. This is throwing some red meat to the dogs. And I think they know exactly what they're doing because they're not trying to litigate this in a court of law. They are assuming that they're above the law. And so they're trying to have this fight out in the public domain on social media, on Twitter. And I would like to see it get into the legal setting where they've actually violated several laws.
I was going to ask about that, and sadly, I only have about a half a minute left. What is, very quickly, possible here, other than perhaps some out-of-bounds activity within the legislature itself, censure, something like that? Yes. What is legally possible? And I apologize for the short time.
That's okay. So there are laws in Utah that prevent people from impersonating law enforcement. I think there's a strong argument to be made for their letter impersonating law enforcement by issuing a cease and desist order and claiming to be able to prosecute when they can't do that. That's against the law in Utah. There's also a civil rights violation that they violated the abortion providers' due process rights by telling them that they can't do something that they're actually legally entitled to do. That would require the abortion providers, though, to sue civilly, which would eat up some of their legal budget, which is why I think a public lawsuit is a better option.
Professor Brown, thank you for joining us here
welcome.
On Sunday Edition. And thanks to all of you for joining us today. We'll be off next week for the broadcast of the 192nd Semi-Annual Conference of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We hope you'll have a nice weekend, and we'll see you in a couple of weeks. Music and the spoken word is next.